Welcome, everybody, to the show. Tonight with me is Clint Warren-Davey. He is the designer of the upcoming Werewolf game. It's called Werewolf. It's not about werewolves, except that it kind of is. We'll talk about that. It is now available for pre-order on Legion Wargames website. I will put a link to the pre-order page in the video description if you are interested. Clint, thanks for coming by tonight.
Yeah, thank you. It's morning here in Australia, but yeah, it's happy to be here.
That's true. This actually works out pretty good for me because it's Sunday evening here and Monday morning for you. So,
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
that actually works out. So I remembered, by the way, the question I was going to ask you. So I'll ask it up front so I won't forget it again. What's
Mm.
it like buying war games in Australia? Because
Ah,
I hear many horror stories about how difficult it
yeah.
is to get a place, especially American games, and
Yes.
I guess ADG games now too. Unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically like living on another planet. You would wait, I don't know, 6 months, maybe sometimes a year. I had a friend order a war game that we both really wanted to play from Columbia Games, Bobby
Mhm.
Lee, and I think we waited 2 or 3 years to get it. And it's and I've got another friend who was trying to get a Kickstarter game, and he also waited 3 years. And that's not just the shipping; that's a bunch of other factors as well. But yeah, it's expensive and it's a long way away. So that does put a bit of a damper on the war game market here in Australia. But we've still got a lot of people that play war games, of course. Like,
Yeah,
still possible to get
there's
them. It's good
Yeah, I
community.
mean, are there any publishers down there that aren't ADG actually? I
There are. There's a lot. They're not war games though.
Okay.
There are a lot of Euro games, family games, party games, but no, ADG would be the only war game publisher
Okay.
in Australia. At the one from what I know, but yeah,
Yeah,
that's
me
basically
too. They're the
yeah.
only ones. Harry and company are the only ones I can think of. All right, so let's talk about Werewolf. This
Mm,
is a game that is in development, and you've been working on it for a while now. I know.
yeah.
So tell us about sort of the theme of the game. You've got sort of an alternate history scenario here. So tell me about that scenario, and then what kind of steps you had to take to make that work from the historical events.
Mm, yeah, sure. Well, to tell you about the theme of the game, it is based on a real thing that existed. A group called the Werewolves, um, founded by the SS right towards the end of World War II. So sort of they started thinking about this 1943, 44, and basically using their experience of fighting partisans on the Eastern Front, especially in Ukraine, they had planned to have a guerrilla organization to fight an insurgency against the Allies and the Soviets as they were invading Germany. And there was two parts to this. There was going to be some special forces SS guys that were going to be stay behind commandos, so stay behind the line and strike at the enemy at their supply lines as they move into Germany. And then the other part was getting civilians to join the movement as guerrillas, just using whatever weapons they could find, and lead an insurgency, essentially like what happened in Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan or any number of insurgencies. That was part of the plan. Now, Hitler didn't actually give this his top priority funding, didn't give it very good leadership, wasn't very well organized, it was very haphazard. So, in the end, the werewolves, they did exist. They probably killed about 1,000 people in total, not just Americans or Soviets, but German citizens who were considered traitors or defeatists or whatever. But they didn't really have much of an impact. Obviously, 1945, the war's over, Hitler kills himself, the Americans occupy the country, and they pretty quickly stabilize it. There are still werewolves holding out in the mountains in Bavaria until 1947, but by then they are crushed. All right, so the idea for our game is what if the werewolf movement is not this complete failure? What if it becomes a serious insurgency? And I got this inspiration from sort of a couple of different things. 2021, the US pulled out of Afghanistan after 20 years of fighting an insurgency. I know you've done a video on A Distant Plain, so there's obviously a coin game about that. And I was just thinking, they were not able to defeat the Taliban in 20 years. They were able to defeat Germany by 1945, and that did not descend into this 20-year insurgency, even though you could make the argument that the Nazis and the German population in general are just as radicalized as the Taliban, or compared to Vietnam, like the Viet Cong. You would expect, and they did expect, the American military leadership did expect Germany to turn into an insurgency. Remember, in World War I, they never occupied the country. Right, so this is the first time that Germany was occupied by Allied armies, and they fully expected this to drag on for years and years and years. So what we're doing with the game is we're taking that idea of the werewolves and saying this is a real insurgency, and this is going to drag on for years and years, and it's going to be a guerrilla war. And the other thing that happens at this time is it's 1945. The Soviets have half of Germany, the Americans have the other half. So it is also a Cold War game. The early stages of the Cold War are a big part of it. So we have events like the Berlin blockade and the Soviet space program and the Cambridge Five, all those show up as events. So if you think about the game as it's partially like Twilight Struggle. We have a few things that are similar to Twilight Struggle for anyone in your listeners who's played that before. Brilliant game.
No, nobody's ever heard of it.
No. It's still up there as one of the top.
Yeah. No, it's a great game. And I am positive in all seriousness that everybody watching the show probably, in fact, has heard of it. And as at least, even if they haven't played it, they're probably at least somewhat familiar with it through osmosis, if nothing else. It's so popular.
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, if you like that kind of thing, the Cold War, and that kind of indirect struggle, it's got that in it as well. But the core of the game is counterinsurgency modeled very closely on Volker Runke's coin system, which began with ND and Abyss. And I know you're familiar with that series. You've done some videos on it. I'm sure all your listeners know what that series is. It's up to something like 11, well, probably more now, volumes.
I lost count, something like
that. Yeah, there's a lot. So we've taken that system where you've got the underground guerrillas. I've got some of the pieces here for it. So cylinders, and when they flip them when they're underground versus active. So hidden movement. We have the cards, which have the faction icons along the top. That determines the turn order. And we have the sequence of play, which is kind of similar to how Volker had in the original ND and Abyss, but with a few little tweaks. So a lot of it is coin-based. Now, with the theme, we have 4 factions. I wanted to make it from the beginning a 4-faction classic coin-style game. I know there's 2 and 3 player, but I prefer the 4-player. So to run you through the factions, which is really that's the core of the theme of the game here, we have the werewolves, first of all, which are these Nazi guerrillas recruited from the SS and from the Hitler Youth and fanatical German civilians. So they're a large-scale insurgency. In our alternate history timeline, they have been given top priority. They've got heaps of funding. They number in the hundreds of thousands, and they're scattered all across Germany, especially in the south, in Bavaria, which is the Nazi heartland, right? So we have the werewolves, and they're led by the likes of Otto Skorzeny and Walter Schellenberg. They've got Goebbels manning their propaganda over the radio. So we have that in the game as well. So any of the guys that you think of like the true Nazis after the war, if they've survived, they've joined the werewolves. We then have the 2 superpowers. We have the Allies, which is really the US, Britain, and France. They are occupying West and Southern Germany. They are trying to rebuild Germany into a democracy. They are using the Marshall Plan, right, pouring in funds to rebuild it so that the Nazis and the communists can't gain too many civilian supporters. They also have a lot of air power. They control the skies. There we go. There's the map. And we have the Soviets. They start off in the east. They have, as you can see on that map, red and orange cubes. The red is the Red Army, and the orange is the NKVD, and also the Stasi. So basically, that's their equivalent of the police. And they are trying to take over as much of Germany as possible, using the insurgency as an excuse to move beyond the demarcation line of the Potsdam Agreement. So Stalin was told, you can have this much and no further. In our timeline, Stalin is using this insurgency throughout Germany to say to the Allies, well, I'm going to help you out in crushing the werewolves. I'm just going to let the Red Army roll on down into Bavaria or even up into Lower Saxony and into Allied territory. So the Soviets are trying to grab land, destroy the insurgents, and build up a very large communist state in Germany. And then lastly, you'll see on the map, the yellow is Edelweiss. And these are anti-Nazi German guerrillas. So you'll see the little flower symbol, the Edelweiss flower. So these guys are the name is based on the Edelweiss Pirates, who are a kind of romantic youth movement that were around in the 30s and 40s. They were still around after the war. They hate the communists and they hate the Nazis. We've merged the Edelweiss Pirates, with a number of anti-Nazi German resistance groups, mainly the Black Orchestra. So von Stauffenberg there's a movie with Tom Cruise in it, Valkyrie, where that's about basically the plot of July 20th, 1944 to kill Hitler. those guys are all sort of reactionary, right-wing Prussian aristocrats. They're on the right, but they don't like the Nazis. They think that Hitler's leading Germany into ruin. They want to restore the country to basically what it was like in the 1890s or the early 1900s. So, and they hate the communists. So we have 4 factions, and they're all sort of have a different ideology and a different vision for what they want Germany to be like. All of them want to be the legitimate ruling power in the country, but it's an insurgency. They're all competing for the sympathies and the loyalty of the civilian population. And so, just like in a classic coin game, you see the population can be pulled in different directions. Usually in coin games, there's only 2 directions. You have support and opposition, or it might be reworded as something else. In this, there's actually 3 directions that the population can be pulled in. They can either be in a state of resistance, and if they're in a state of active resistance, they're full-on Nazis. They're pro-werewolf. Passive resistance is they hate the occupiers, they hate the Soviets and the Americans, and they're willing to lend a hand to the werewolves or Edelweiss. So that's resistance. And then you can branch off into Allied loyalty or Soviet loyalty. And the Allied loyalty basically means they want democracy and capitalism. And then Soviet loyalty means they want communism, or they're just terrified of the Red Army and they're willing to do what the Soviets say. So it's a true 3-way contest for the loyalty of the population. Edelweiss is not directly trying to influence that for their victory condition. They want control, but they are going to influence it because it helps them recruit and it stops the other powers getting victory points. So the terrain that you fight the game over is mostly based on what the population thinks in each area. Right? And when you do, a terror action, like coin games all have the terror action or the terror operation, that's how you shift the population towards you, towards your loyalty as the insurgents. And when I was thinking about that, if you've seen the movie Fury, with a Brad Pitt movie about the tank crew, I don't know if you might remember there's a scene where they're driving their tank into Germany and yet they've seen the SS has strung up people from a lamppost or a tree, and they've hung a sign on them saying, these are traitors or cowards or whatever. That is basically a werewolf terror operation, right? It's pretty gruesome stuff, but this is what it would have looked like. This is what it did look like, and we're extrapolating that out longer because the insurgency is dragging on. So you have this 4-way struggle. It's over the loyalty of the population. The Allies and the Soviets are also competing for the remnants of Hitler's technological projects. So the Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons. So we have things like the prototypes of the V2 rocket or the Maus tank or these early Messerschmitt jets, a whole bunch of other technological projects and top scientists like Werner von Braun. They're scattered around the map because in 1945, the Germans are desperately trying to salvage whatever they've got left of their research projects that they'd poured all these resources into and not let them fall into the hands of the Allies or the Soviets. Those research tokens can be captured by any faction. The Americans will send it back home to Washington. The Soviets send it back home to Moscow to fuel their arms race. Right? That's part of this Cold War element. So they want the research. Werewolf can use the research as their function as weapons. They can do a Wunderwaffen strike. They spend a research token and they can do an attack with a random effect. Or any of the factions can just sell the research on the black market for money. So you have these little tokens scattered around the map, and that forms a key part of what they're competing over, as well as the usual counterinsurgency type operations that you're going to see. There's patrol and search, and there's airstrikes and bombard. There's the insurgents are going to infiltrate. They can ambush. They can assassinate. So all that kind of stuff, all that that sneaky counterinsurgency stuff is happening all across the map. But yeah, the core of it is you're competing over the future of Germany, what Germany's going to look like by 1948, 1949, and what the people think and where their loyalties are. So that's kind of the theme of the game in a nutshell. Hopefully that sort of sums it up.
Okay. So it sounds like there's kind of a lot going on in here. So tell me about the kinds and breadth of sources that you drew upon to sort of build not only the alternate history itself, but the way that the mechanics interact with that. Obviously you had to do some research on the so-called wonder weapons and the insurgency, which I suspect a lot of wargamers probably figure it just ended in May of 1945 over here, right? I mean, I knew there was some small scale stuff after that, but I didn't know that it lasted that long
Yeah.
or was as big a deal as it sounds like it was. So tell me what kind of sources you drew upon in the design.
Yeah, sure. So my design partner, Ben Feeney, is very knowledgeable in this as well. He's done a lot of the background research for the game. But what I have used a lot of is, first of all, there's an alternate history author called Harry Turtledove, who's written a number of books with this kind of theme. And he's got one that's it's basically this, right? It's basically the werewolves become this massive insurgency. And in his
Is this the one with the aliens?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. No,
I read the one with the aliens.
No, no aliens in this one. It's basically Heydrich, Reinhard Heydrich, who's this top, SS kind of guy, isn't assassinated as he was in 1943. He survives, and he takes charge of the werewolves. Historically, the werewolves were run by this guy von Prutzmann, who's not a very effective leader, and he wasn't given the resources or the organization to pull it off. But in this one, in the Turtledove timeline, Heydrich leads the werewolves in this massive insurgency, and the Soviets are just brutal. They have these massive crackdowns, and likewise the Americans are fighting a counterinsurgency. So that is a big inspiration for us. I started reading about that book and go, that's really interesting. And a lot of the stuff about the research projects, that's just something that I just did a lot of searching up on the internet, and again, my design partner Ben Feeney's got several books on the subject of German Wunderwaffen, and a lot of wargamers will recognize this stuff, and they know about V2 rockets and the jet aircraft they're making by the end of the war. And there's not a huge amount of published books on the werewolves or just about insurgency in occupied Germany. There are some, but there's really only one sort of guy that's really into it. Let me just find the name of this book, because there's very, very few. So there's a guy in Canada called Perry Biddiscombe. And he's a historian, professional historian. He's probably the world's foremost expert on the werewolves, and he's written a lot of books on them. He's written one in particular called The Last Nazis, SS Werewolf Guerrilla Resistance in Europe, 1944 to 47. He also had a book on SS Hunter Battalions, and he's got a few other ones as well. So he basically went through and researched every military action that could be attributed to the werewolves. And he said, this is where I'm getting this figure from, he said they probably killed around about 1,000 people. And he said most historians have dismissed the werewolves because they didn't do very much, or they didn't do nothing. But he said what they achieved, it wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing either. So he says the occupation of Germany was not as peaceful as you would be led to believe. He's saying that the Allies maybe would have liked to institute a liberal democracy when they occupied the country, but they had to pretty brutally denazify the population. Right? So if you read the actual policy of denazification in Germany, it is anyone remotely connected with the Nazi party cannot be allowed anywhere near any position of power. And these young guys that were, Hitler Youth members, a lot of them were sort of locked up in prison because it was suspected that they might join the werewolves as well. And US Army soldiers were told by their commanders, do not fraternize with the enemy. Don't look a German in the eye. Don't make friends with them. Don't accept food from them. Watch your step. Don't walk down a dark alley at night. Be careful if you're riding your Jeep on the highway, because there might be a roadside bomb waiting for you. Watch out for snipers. Some of the civilians are going to be snipers and start picking us off. So the general attitude is there's not many werewolves, but they create a massive sense of fear and excessive caution. And also they make the occupation a bit harsher than what you would think. General Patton is one of the few American generals who's kind of saw through all this. Patton is famous for being one of these hard-fighting generals, charged of the Third Army, led the drive across France and into Germany. He was told about the werewolves. U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps was basically warning the army, the werewolves are not a myth. This is a real organization. So you guys on the front line and even behind the front line, you need to watch out. Basically, do not trust any Germans that you see. And Patton said, this is all just bullshit. We've defeated the Germans. You don't need to worry about this stuff. In true Patton style. He's one of the few that got it right. He was saying, we don't need to worry about this. These are a defeated people. They're not going to rise up They said there's 2 million Nazis out of uniform back in the civilian population. They could rise up at any moment and take back the country. Patton's saying that's not going to happen. He saw it sort of for what it was. And the Soviets similarly expected large-scale resistance. And the Soviets, of course, crushed it in their usual way. Okay, so the Soviets, mass deportations, they send them to the Gulag. They send in the tanks, Berlin Uprising, 1950, 1953. There's massive strike action throughout East Germany, and the Soviets send in the tanks and just crush it, which is basically what they would have done in 1945 if there was a large werewolf movement. However, our timeline makes things a little bit harder. So we understand that there's a big power imbalance. The Allies and the Soviets have got way more firepower. They've got big armies. They're probably going to be able to crush the werewolves if they can catch them. But in our timeline, not only are the werewolves much better funded, much better equipped, but the war has not gone very well for the Allies or the Soviets. That the Allies have botched D-Day. They've still managed to get ashore, but they've taken in excess of 1 million losses, and the war is still dragging on. So there's a peace movement at home to bring the troops home. So you imagine the occupation of Germany going on into 1948, and people are sick of the body bags coming home. They want to end it. So the Allies have got this morale in the game. They have a level of morale that will drop as they take casualties and as bad things happen. And also the Cold War competition with the Soviets can affect that. So as the Soviets, they've got a number of event cards that can push Allied morale down. So the Allies are under a bit of a time pressure to crush this insurgency with minimum losses because they have already taken unacceptable losses from D-Day. Also, nuclear weapons aren't ready yet. That's the other one. So we pondered this scenario of, well, if the Germans are still fighting after August 1945, wouldn't they just nuke the whole country? And I say, well, first of all, they probably wouldn't do this anyway, even if they had the means to, because they have already occupied the country. And we have no examples of nuclear weapons being used in an insurgency. They've only been used against Japan, and this is not when American soldiers were on Japanese soil. This is obvious. Everyone knows how that happened. But basically, in our timeline, we say the nukes are not ready yet either. Now, the Allies will develop them throughout the course of the game as they capture the research tokens and send them home. That's going to help them. They will eventually make the breakthrough and have nuclear weapons, but that is mainly a propaganda effect. It affects the Cold War, and it affects the loyalty of the German population in Europe because they know that the Americans have nuclear weapons, which means they're under the protection of a nuclear superpower. The Soviets can then do the same thing. Right? So historically, the Soviets had their first nuclear bomb operational in 1949, which is basically roughly within our time period anyway. So we've got the Soviets can develop the bomb, has a similar effect to the Allies, ramps up Cold War tensions, kind of like the DEFCON level, and gives them a massive propaganda boost, hurts Allied morale, and so on. So this timeline is the insurgency is a lot bigger than it was historically, and we have a few other twists that make it harder for the Allies and the Soviets to crush it. But yeah, in terms of the historical background, like the source material, I'd say, Perry Bitterscombe is the number one expert on the werewolves. But yeah, those Harry Turtledove books are a good source as well. And if any of your readers want to do a bit more, if they want to learn a bit more about this, our game will include a playbook with a full paragraph about every card. We've got 100 cards. Everyone's going to have a paragraph in the playbook describing the historical background and why we included it in the game. I've also got a number of articles coming out on the Player's Aid blog about basically going through each card. Like
those guys.
Yeah. Have you heard of them?
Oh, no, never heard of them. Don't know who you're talking about.
Yeah. So, yeah, basically every card in the game is going to have historical background, and people will be able to learn all about it. And it's a very, very interesting history. This blend of World War II, Cold War, counterinsurgency, all blending together. It's a very, very interesting backdrop for the game. And I'd recommend it even if you're a experienced player of the Coin series. You will still get a lot out of Werewolf because the theme is so different, and our cards and our operations and our special activities and the course of the game and some of our little special rules in there is a very, very different experience.
So what is the time frame of the game? It's obviously starts pretty much in 1945, but how late into the Cold War period does it go?
Well, on the box we're saying 1948, but that's very open-ended. I mean, we've again, my design partner here, Ben Feeney, he sort of set that limit because the map that we're using is literally the map that the Allies and the Soviets were using in 1945, like the provinces and the cities and the division of the country. That's the map they're using. 1949, there's a whole territorial adjustment in Germany. You have the foundation of the West German Federal Republic and the German Democratic Republic in the east, and they redrew the boundaries of a lot of the provinces. So basically, Ben said, just so people don't nitpick over the map, let's go. It's 1945 to 1948. And also so we don't getting into the 1950s. I mean, we could. In fact, Himmler was talking to Hitler and predicted that the Allies and the Soviets would be going to war with each other in 1950. So he said, if we just go into the mountains and lead an insurgency, we can take back the country in 1950. But that's getting into the Korean War and a few other things. And we've basically just arbitrarily said, no, we'll just leave it at 1948 now. But there's no, like with the coin games, there's no time scale. So like every turn is 6 months or whatever. Yeah. If you want the game, if you want to imagine the game going until 1956, you can. I mean, it's not.
I mean, yeah, there's a certain amount of wiggle room built into the mechanics where there's a certain arbitrariness whenever the scoring happens, which I might ask about in a second. So but we're on you kind of talked a lot about the Allies versus the Soviets and the Cold War part of it. So let's talk about the sort of differences between the way the Allies interact with pieces and spaces on the map versus the way the Soviets interact with them.
Sure. Yeah. So the Allies, their victory condition is based on the loyalty of the population, total Allied loyalty, plus their morale, plus their position in the arms race. And also the Allies, as opposed to the Soviets, have basically total control of the skies. They have air superiority, which was demonstrated to the Soviets historically in the Berlin airlift. Right? So the Allies were able to resupply West Berlin by the air and feed a population of 3 million people entirely through aircraft. Right? So that is built into the game. The Allies can do airlift to anywhere on the map. They can just pick up troops, transport and drop them off. There's a capability card in the deck, helicopters, because they were early helicopters at the end of World War II. That boosts their airlift. So they have probably the most mobility of any faction in the game. They can airstrike anywhere. Now, if they do airstrike in a province or a city, it'll shift that city or province towards resistance. It'll make it more pro-werewolf because the civilians are getting angry from all the collateral damage, so they can't use it all the time. They have to use it sparingly, but they can use airstrikes to take out a lot of enemy guerrillas. And the Allies, their main way of building up their victory point level, building up the amount of Allied loyalty, they've got two main ways to do that. First of all is reconstruction, which is physically rebuilding the country. And it costs them a lot of their resources, but they're the richest faction. They've got the money that they can spend it on. It just means while you're spending money on that, you're not spending it on fighting the guerrillas. So you have to balance your budget, in quite a challenging way to do. So they can do reconstruction in places where they have control. So they basically just spend money to shift the loyalty up towards Allied loyalty. They also have trials, which is one of their special actions. So if they reveal or kill guerrillas, what that represents is they've rounded up a couple of hundred guerrillas. Some of them, you can put them on trial, like the Nuremberg trials, right? And they'll say, we're going to have a judge and we're going to do this, show that we are committed to procedural justice, that we're not like the Soviets. We're going to do it fairly. We're going to give you a trial and then we're going to hang you. And we're going to interrogate you and question you while you're on the dock. So we're going to find out information about your buddies somewhere else. So if you, as the Allies, kill or reveal guerrillas during your turn, your special action can be a trial where you can reveal more guerrillas and shift a city closer towards your loyalty. So that's the primary way that they're going to win during the course of the game, is using these trials and reconstruction to build loyalty, taking out the enemy with their air power and their commandos. They have commando raids as one of their little options. And they have the most money, so they can afford to do this, but they can't afford to take losses. So you'll find if you're a good Allied player in Werewolf, we've got a good little playtest group here in Australia. We've got quite a few people playing it. If you're a really good Allied player, you keep your troops out of places where they're going to get ambushed or assassinated. You keep them fairly safe. You airlift them in for an assault, and then maybe you airlift them out, or you rely on airstrikes to do most of the fighting, and you're trying to keep your troops safe. The other thing is the Allied police cubes, which so you see this blue and green. Blue is Allied troops. These are American soldiers, but also members of the Bundeswehr, so loyalist Germans who've joined the Allied occupation government's army. And the green cubes are police, and they're West German police who are loyal to the Allied regime. So Allied police, if they die, doesn't affect your morale because they're local Germans. So you can get your German police forces to do a lot of the dirty work in hunting down guerrillas, while you keep your actual American troops safe in your bases and in your cities, and only have them come out when they're going to be, assaulting a particularly tough target. So that's kind of like how the Allies play. If for those who've played a lot of coin games, it's kind of like playing as the US in A Distant Plain or Fire in the Lake. It's kind of like that, but again, quite a few differences. How the Soviets interact with the map is quite different. They don't care about losses. They don't have a morale level they have to keep track of. So the Soviets can afford to lose men. The Soviets can also, if they have a really troublesome area of the map that's got lots of werewolf loyalty, lots of resistance, they can just deport it. So you lower the population of the space permanently. Those people have been sent to Siberia, and the space shifts directly to neutral. So it hurts you because you're lowering the population of a space that you control, but it clears out any resistance in the space. All the guerrillas, they don't have any loyalty because the population is just gone. They also, rather than the Allies' reconstruction, the Soviets indoctrinate, it's very similar, has the same effect, but they can't do it as much. They can only shift a space up by one. They can shift it one level towards Soviet loyalty. So it's not as effective. So the Allies have this advantage in trying to build up their own loyalty. The Soviets are not as good at that. But what the Soviets are good at is just crushing guerrillas wherever they can find them. So aside from their deport actions, because the Soviet operations are cheaper, their troops are cheaper, they can use a combination of things like transport and assault. They can use interrogate. So this is one of their special actions where they can, if you kill or capture a guerrilla, you interrogate them, you roll the dice and reveal that many guerrillas anywhere else on the map, because you're asking the guys, like, where are your buddies? Where are they on the map? They can bombard, which is with their troops and their heavy equipment tokens. It's nothing I haven't mentioned yet, but there's heavy equipment tokens in the game, which represents tanks, artillery, mortars, and other stuff. The insurgents can capture those and use them against the occupiers. But while they're in your hands as the Soviets, that's your big guns and your tanks, and you can use that for bombardment, which is, you can sweep into an area and then, as your special action, bombard and basically destroy it. So the Soviets, if you imagine them as like a hammer that can crush guerrillas, very easily and regardless of losses. And then the Allies are more like doing surgical strikes around the map and playing a lot more cautiously. That's kind of how those two interact. And then how they interact with each other, because they're not just fighting guerrillas, they're kind of confronting each other, is as the Cold War tensions track goes up, they treat each other as enemies. So if there's Soviets moving along a road and they encounter some Allied police, they stop. Right, so there's this like little tense situation where they're going to be staring at each other. It stops the movement. And also, if either one of them takes the other's territory, takes control away from the other one, say you're the Allies and you march an armored column of American troops into Weimar, which is a Soviet-occupied city, take away control, tensions go up. And if the tensions get to the highest level and a crisis round happens, that's the scoring rounds, game over. You've triggered World War III. And you've lost. The insurgents, one of the two insurgent factions, will win. So it's kind of like the DEFCON track in Twilight Struggle. And every time you do something to annoy each other, or go into the enemy's territory, or play a card that hurts them, that track is going to go up. And then what the Allies and the Soviets have to do is waste time negotiating. You have to spend your turn in negotiations with the other superpower to bring tensions back down. So of course the insurgents want that to happen. Like Ardwulf and Werwolf want the Allies and the Soviets to be stepping on each other's toes and then having to waste time negotiating. And they can do that deliberately. The Ardwulf can use false flag. It's one of their special activities. It's basically you kill a guy, but what you've done is captured uniforms. So you've captured Russian uniforms and gone into an American base and killed a bunch of Americans, and then they obviously blame it on the Soviets. Tensions go up. So that's kind of how those two superpowers interact with the map.
Okay. And then we just started getting into how the Edelweiss faction. I think that's the one that I think probably I have the least clear picture of at this point in my understanding of the game. So
yeah.
Talk about them. What their victory conditions look like?
Yeah, so the Edelweiss, they're aiming for control because they're anti-communist, they're anti-Nazi, and they don't like democracy either because they're sort of run by these Prussian aristocrats. They are trying to have themselves recognized as the legitimate government of Germany once the war is over. So they want the werewolves gone. They want the Allies and the Soviets to reach some kind of negotiated settlement where they pull out of the country and give them power. So basically, they want the position of what the Taliban was last year, when America pulls out, and they go, right, you run the country now, because you on the ground, you actually control it. And the Edelweiss are the smallest faction. They have the smallest number of pieces on the map, but because they're run by like von Stauffenberg, who orchestrated all these sort of bomb plots and stuff, and they're run by a lot of sort of Eastern Front veterans, not so much SS guys. They're probably more on the werewolves, but they do have some experienced guys with them. They have Rommel is an Edelweiss member. Rommel's still alive. That's a little twist in the plot. The Brandenburger division have joined Edelweiss. So if we go into our little timeline, there's a lot of sort of elite special forces types or intelligence types. The Abwehr, Wilhelm von Canaris, he was the head of the Abwehr, which is German military intelligence. They have all joined Edelweiss. So you think of them as they're fighting kind of like an elite guerrilla special forces type faction. Their actions are very potent. They can do a lot of cool stuff. But what they're trying to do is establish direct control over as much of the country as possible, so that when the insurgency is over, they are the German government, right? So they're going to bring Germany back to, say, pre-World War One, and they're also joined by basically just ordinary German civilians who don't like the Nazis, but they don't want the country to be occupied by the Soviets or the Americans either. So they're the faction that's actually attracted a lot of interest, sort of on Twitter and just in when people play the game. They go, "Who are these guys?" Very strange, because that's the one that we kind of have diverted most from the history. We've kind of thrown together some interesting elements there that you're not going to see anywhere else. But they are really fun to play as. They've got a small footprint, but their pieces can do a lot of cool stuff. And they have some really interesting cards in the deck too. They're usually eligible more than the other factions. They usually have the initiative. So a lot of their cards, you can play it, and then you're still eligible next turn. If you play a coin game, normally you're only acting every second turn. It's common for Edelweiss to be constantly hitting throughout the course of the deck, because the event card deck keeps a lot of their cards keep them eligible. Plus, they can infiltrate, they can steal other people's pieces, they can do those false flag attacks. Their terror is very effective; it shifts it directly to neutral. So yeah, that's basically how the Edelweiss work.
So
let's werewolves as well. Do you want to know about the werewolves?
Yeah, let's talk about them. Let's talk about starting with their victory conditions, because that tends to drive a lot of the activity in these types of games.
Yeah, well, their victory condition is total resistance on the map. So the amount of German people that are on their side that are basically willing to resist the Allies for however long, plus their number of bases. Edelweiss have that too. Your bases are worth victory points too. So the werewolves are mainly going to rely on terror for that. So they're going to try and spread out, perform lots of terror actions around the map. And then the other ways they can strike at the enemy is they can ambush, as can Edelweiss. They can assassinate, which is just picking off a couple of troops here and there if you've got underground guerrillas. And they can use their Wunderwaffen strikes, which is, like I said before, using the research tokens to fire off some experimental weapon. They also can use capture, so they can capture heavy equipment tokens and research tokens from the enemy. So that's a very handy thing to have. So if you've got like a column of Soviet tanks moving into werewolf country, they can steal some tanks. You know, they're quite adept at that. And they start off with a pretty big presence in southern Germany, and they have a single guerrilla in West Berlin, which is an Allied occupied city. It's the highest population city on the map. They start off with a werewolf guerrilla there, which is very, very handy for them in the early game. And they also have a couple of bases, and they control a couple of cities at the start. If you look at the map setup, the Allies have been pushed back into Nuremberg. Basically, when the game starts, the werewolf insurgency has just flared up, and the Allies have got a couple of their dudes being pushed back into Nuremberg, and the rest of Bavaria and Munich, Stuttgart, Frankfurt, all these cities in southern Germany are werewolf occupied. So, yeah, that's basically their position in the game. And we've got a solo variant and a non-player rules for those who don't want to play as the werewolves, because I get it. A lot of people don't want to play as Nazi guerrillas. Totally understandable. You can do a 3-player game and have the bot, AI flowchart run the werewolves.
I was actually going to ask about that as my next question, is what does solo capability look like here? Can you bot any of the 4 factions, or is it just the werewolves?
Yes, you can. You can bot any of them. So you could even do a 0-player game if you really wanted to, and just sit back and watch them all, which I have done before. But yeah, you can do it as a solo game. You can do it as 2-player. You can do it as 3-player, and have the bots fill in. Or you can have 2 human players, and each of them have 2 factions. So you can have the insurgents versus the counterinsurgents, right? But yeah, it will come with fully playable solo mode, non-player factions. At the moment, it's flowcharts, and I think I'm going to stick with the flowcharts. I like having the whole AI system run on just one A4 bit of paper, and that's all you need to run it. So that's probably what I'm going to stick with. Just the flowchart system just works really well. Like I was playing Andy and Abyss the other day, and I think that just works really, really well. It's so easy to run. I understand that the coin games now have a card-based system.
That seems to be the new idea on how they're going to move forward with that.
Yeah, and I'm still tossing up whether to include that. I might save that for an expansion, but at the moment I'm going to go with the A4 paper flowcharts. I just really like it. I think it's a way to optimize the bots too, because it's this with the cards. I get it because it's more variability, more randomness. But the flowcharts that I've made are pretty much it's optimal play for that faction within the constraints of not having a human brain to plan ahead. Each turn, that bot is going to be doing the optimal move to maximize their position on the board. And they're quite hard to beat too. I struggle to beat them, and I made the game. I still lose playing this game solo, which is good.
Well, you want the bots and whatever kind of soloable game we're talking about. You want the bots to be challenging, right? So that's pretty standard too. So it sounds like you're pretty far along on the design. Would you say it's like 100%, 90, 95%? How much tinkering are you still doing?
I would say the rules are fine, and we've done the cards. We've got our faction sheets. Rulebook is mostly done, aside from some of the graphics. I'm going to say it's 95% done. And once we get those, once we get the pre-orders up to what we need, we can get it. Basically, we can send the files off to Legion Wargames, and they can start making it, which is a good thing. I mean, I don't want people waiting too long. But like I said, we got to hit a certain number of pre-orders before it jumps to the top of the production queue. But once we do that, we're quite close to having it done. I will say, though, that we are going to be running some more playtesting on Vassal. So we're getting a mod for that. And that is just for some little tinkering and refinement here and there. I'm mostly satisfied with the game and how it's playing, but I understand that we want to get a much, much broader view. We want to get some people from over in the US or around the world to play test it, because mostly it's been Australians who can physically play with a physical copy. Once we have a digital version, we can let anyone play it. I'm happy to send it to you as well, of course, to have a tinker with. Sure. So that should be ready very soon. I would say within the next month we'll have the Vassal mod up and running, and then we can send that out and let's do some additional play testing. And then once we hit the pre-orders, we can send it off to Legion, and I think it's ready to go.
All right. Once again, folks, there is a link in the video description to the pre-order page at the Legion Wargames website. So check that out. So Clint, to wrap us up here, let's. I'm sure you have something else in mind to do after Werewolf gets out the door. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I've got a lot of ideas for what I'm going to do next year for my game design. At the moment, I am kind of sticking to three. There's three designs that I'm going to be focusing on, and I don't know in which order I'm going to do them, but there's three that are really in my mind at the moment. The first one is going to be called Division Commander, and it's going to be an RPG where you are in charge of a division in World War II. So you're not an individual person; you are the division. So you're like the 101st Airborne, and instead of being an RPG character with a whole bunch of stats like your agility and your strength or whatever, what you're managing is like your recon, your engineers, your anti-tank capability, the level of experience in your officers. You'll be promoting officers to be, say, from regimental commander to divisional commander. You'll have to deal with supplies of food, ammunition, fuel, all that kind of stuff. So getting into the actual running of a division. And then when you fight the battles, it's going to be on a campaign map with some kind of like a snakes and ladders type of chart. So that's going to be a really weird one.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I just want to have that RPG experience. And you can do it with a group of people as well, and you command the division together. You might have one of you is the division commander, and the rest of you are regimental commanders, and you get given missions that you have to do, and then the division commander's got to allocate roles out to the regimental commanders, and we want to have that experience of, you've got to make sure the men are fed and supplied, and you've got to cope with whatever the high command gives you, and try. And your men are going to earn medals, and there's different soldiers get promoted. You're going to face challenges that are off the battlefield, that kind of thing. That's still a long way off. That's just an idea at this stage with a few little notes written down. But I'm quite excited to get started on that one. The next one, which I've been thinking about for a while, is a game on the Polish insurgency, which is Poland after World War II, but also during. So from the Warsaw Uprising, 1944, all the way through to either 1947 or 1956. I haven't decided a cutoff date yet, but the Poles after World War II were fighting an insurgency against the Soviets, and it's massive. It goes on for more than 10 years. It's bigger than the French resistance. It's bigger than all other insurgencies in that time period combined. It's bigger than most of the insurgencies of the 20th century. No one knows anything about it. There's no books in English about it. It's quite obscure. I don't speak Polish. This is a big problem. But I do have a lot of people on Twitter who are Polish who are willing to help me out with that. So that's going to be basically a coin-inspired game. Might look something like Werewolf, but I think that's going to go in a different direction. But that's going to be about the Polish insurgency, roughly 1944, 1947. And then the third game, which I want to make, is taking Volker Runke's Levy and Campaign system, which is because I've been playing Nevsky recently, which is a great game. Taking that and turning it into a light 2-hour, fairly simple, low fantasy war game, basically like Root from Leader Games. So I don't know if you've played that. There's a pretty popular.
I haven't played it, but it's
it's not a serious grognardy game. It's good. It's good. Like kids can play. I mean, older kids can play it, I should say. But it's a good fun asymmetric game to play. And basically, what Root was taking the Coin series and repackaging it with these kind of like furry creatures in a woodland setting, and getting it accessible to a much broader market. So if Leader Games can do that with the Coin series, what I want to do is do that with Levy and Campaign. So have something that is focused on medieval operational maneuver and logistics, and having to bring your supplies with you and having to pay your troops and whatever, but done as a much smaller package that you can easily fit into one evening and play casually. Play with a group of 4 people. So that one's going to be called March, just the word March, and that one, low fantasy setting. Something to have a bit of fun with. It's not as serious as the other 2, but that's the 3 designs that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment.
Okay, all of those sound pretty interesting, actually, but there's certainly nothing like that RPG-esque idea floating around. I'd be very curious to see that when you're farther along with it.
Yeah, I'll definitely let you know. I mean, I just put out the idea on Twitter. I was never going to make the game. I just said I had this idea for a RPG as a division commander, and I put it out on Twitter, and then the response was, "Yeah, you should make this."
Yeah, that sounds neat. I'd play that.
Yeah, I'd even got a publisher contact me and said, "Yeah, if you make this, we'll make it." So
there you go. There you go. So thanks, Clint, for taking the time to talk to me about Werewolf, folks. Once again, the link is in the video description, so check out the pre-order page on that if it sounds interesting based on what you have seen here tonight. Please give it a look. And thanks again, Clint, for stopping by. Everybody have a great night.
No worries. Thank you a lot. Thanks for having me.